El Salvador extends its state of emergency. Tens of thousands are arrested as the president cracks down on gangs. But is Nayib Bukele going too far? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is El Salvador's war on gangs. El Salvador is one of the most violent countries in the world, but its millennial president says he's going to change that. Nayib Bukele is young, unique, and polarizing. His policies are controversial and divisive, and inside El Salvador, most people either love him or hate him. One of his biggest challenges since coming to power in 2019 has been taking on the country's numerous armed gangs. Towards the end of March, one weekend of violence left 80 people dead. 62 in a single day. Congress imposed a state of emergency backed by the president, and in the space of a few weeks, more than 30,000 arrests were carried out. But how many of them were justified or even legal?
The arrests are being carried out arbitrarily. Many people are denouncing and have very little information about their family members being arrested. These people don't know about their relative state of health and have doubts about where the prisoners are being held, or don't even know where they are. Also, many of the people detained were providers for the families, and we see the violations of due process and arbitrary detentions generating expansive violations, an expansive wave of violations.
Human rights groups may condemn Bukele's approach, but El Salvador's self-proclaimed world's coolest dictator is committed to the crackdown. In fact, he says he's willing to go even further.
We're in a war against the gangs. I don't care what the international organizations have to say. They can come and protect our people. They can come and take the gangs if they want them so much. We will give them all away. 2 for 1.
Well, those kinds of statements do sit well with some in El Salvador, and while Bukele's crackdown may be brutal, some say it's producing positive results. In 2015, El Salvador faced its deadliest year in decades. More than 6,500 people were killed as a result of gang warfare. That's an average of 18 deaths per day. But since then, there's been a steady fall in the number of homicides. In 2017, there were just under 11 deaths a day. 2 years later, after President Nayib Bukele came to power, that average fell to just over 6.5. Following his first full year in office, it dropped again, this time to 3.7. And last year, El Salvador documented its lowest homicide rate in 2 decades, with just over 3 deaths per day. Those numbers may look good for President Bukele, but the young leader is becoming isolated on the world stage. Since coming to power 3 years ago, he's been accused of dismantling democratic institutions. He now controls almost every branch of government and is paving the way for himself to stay in power. An authoritarian tag doesn't seem to bother him either. His own Twitter bio used to read, "the world's coolest dictator." And his war on gangs has made him arguably popular at home, with one poll showing his approval rating standing at around 70%. Just listen to what some in El Salvador think of their president.
We have stopped paying extortion. We are not paying anything now. The boys have not been seen. They have practically disappeared and business is flowing. People are no longer afraid to come to the center and walk the streets.
I agree with the president because he has to crack down on the gangs. Otherwise, there will be more murders and our families will be at risk. I agree with him.
So is this hardcore crackdown on gangs what El Salvadorians want? And are they willing to see violations of human rights to maintain it? Here to debate that now is, from London, Javier Farje. He's a journalist and Latin America analyst. From Jersey City is Jonathan Rosen, an assistant professor of professional security studies at New Jersey City University, specializing in drug trafficking and organized crime. And in Manchester is Colin Harding, a Latin America analyst and director of the consultancy firm Latin Forum. Thanks all so much for being with us. First, Jonathan, I'm going to start with you. I feel we should provide some context, as briefly as possible, really, and explain why El Salvador has this massive and somewhat unique gang problem. It didn't come out of nowhere. What created it?
Sure, it's a complicated and long history. I mean, MS-13, for example, started in Los Angeles in the 1980s of Salvadoran immigrants fleeing as a result of deportation practices in the early 90s and mid 90s. We've seen the gang population balloon in the Northern Triangle as a result of high levels of inequality in El Salvador, corruption. And failed gang strategies, the gang has ballooned. There are an estimated 70,000 gangs alone in El Salvador. 450,000 people have ties to gang ties, whether it's family members or loved ones. And we've seen a number of crackdowns, not just with Bukele, with previous administrations, focusing on what we would say in Spanish is mano dura or iron fist policies. And frankly, they haven't worked. And so it's a complicated situation where we've seen secret negotiations between gangs and the government. Those fail and break down, and we've seen violence spike.
Right. I want to talk more about those secret negotiations, but you know, El Salvador has a lot of trauma in its recent history, not least because of the Civil War. And some even say this gang problem is mostly a product of that war and the families, you know, that were destroyed because of it. So do you think what's happening now is actually adding more trauma to an already traumatized society?
Yes, I do. I think the high levels of violence, the high levels of human rights abuses, El Salvador has been plagued by issues of corruption and impunity and failing to strengthen the state apparatus. I think this has only increased the levels of trauma. It's not solving the underlying issues. And we see while Bukele remains quite popular among his base, it's not solving the long-term, deep-seated problems. And so I would agree with your assessment that it's increasing the level of trauma. It might be popular with some of the base and kind of these show-and-tell strategies, but frankly, it's a continuation of what I would argue is failed policies over time.
Okay. Colin, are you on the same page there? I mean, is just locking people up and throwing away the key the best solution to gang violence, or do root causes have to be both recognized and addressed?
Well, that would be nice. But yes, I do agree that this policy has been tried before and without notable success. The thing is now that Bukele virtually has a free hand to try whatever he feels like. And of course, he has a huge majority in Congress. I mean, the other traditional political parties are completely discredited and have hardly any representation anymore, which is a phenomenon that's happening in other countries as well in Latin America. So he has a sort of personal rule which is virtually unchecked. And so it's impossible to know what he's going to do next, really. And he's not very transparent. And what we've had really is a sort of succession of stunts. And the truth with MS-13, which has been talked about, which broke down and led to the present state of exception, which was passed by Congress, gives the government and the security forces the free hand to do exactly as they feel like. So yes, I mean, human rights have really gone out of the window. I mean, people just picked up and locked up on suspicion that they're members of a gang. Some clearly are, but not necessarily. There have been cases of people who've gone to do them.
Right. I mean, do you think that realistically this problem could be solved more compassionately? Because Bukele supporters argue you need to fight fire with fire. The cause is too far gone. These people are too hardened. You can't rehabilitate this strong of a. I don't want to. Really, that you have to fight fire with fire because these men are too far gone and they can't be brought back into the normal societal fold.
Well, the iron fist approach is certainly popular. As it's been said, it's happened, it's been tried many times before, not just in El Salvador, and it's not really been very successful. The counter argument is that really there are social, political and economic reasons for the prevalence of gang membership, and perhaps if some of the underlying problems of Salvadorian society of poverty, inequality and corruption and so on were tackled more convincingly, well, perhaps people would be less inclined to join gangs. But of course, that's easily said, but not so easy to carry out. And Bukele doesn't appear to be interested in trying that approach at the moment.
Right. Okay, let me ask Javier, How polarizing is Bukele's hardcore crackdown among El Salvadorians themselves right now? Would you say, actually, that there are now some similar dynamics to how Filipinos, for example, would view former President Duterte's war on drugs in the Philippines?
I think the parallel that you are making between the Philippines and El Salvador is quite accurate. The question we have to ask ourselves is, has it worked and at what price? The answer for the first one is not really, and the second was a very high price. See, here is the issue here, that the measures that the government is implementing to fight these gangs do not fit the actual crimes that these gangs commit. I mean, for example, to send a kid of 16-year-old to 10 years in prison won't solve the problem, because it is believed that the order to start the latest wave of attacks and violence came from the prisons where many of these gang members are sort of held. But second, many of these, just to complement what was said before, many of those people who were deported from the US to El Salvador went to a country that they hardly knew, where there were no opportunities for them to change anything in their lives. They transferred the culture of violence from the US to El Salvador, and they were not given, apart from some isolated projects, the opportunity to reintegrate themselves into a society they hardly knew. And so the only world they've known is violence. The only world they know is the gang. Therefore, they stick to what we know rather than what they don't actually know. So many people support this polarizing, yet many people support. I mean, El País, the newspaper, did a survey in early April in El Salvador, and I would like to quote what a woman who was waiting outside a prison said. I support what the government is doing. It's very good to give us security, but they are taking away innocent people, kids who have done nothing. Those kids who do not want to be members of the gangs do not have options of employment and sport. And I would ask the president to do something about that. So there's a key issue here. You can put, first of all, the prisons never rehabilitate people. They tend to reinforce the culture of violence and gangs. Right. They transfer that, and therefore, so there's got to be a process of policing on one side, which is necessary because it's affecting the poorest members of society, but at the same time, there's got to be programs to be able to rehabilitate. And many people say, well, yes, some gang members will never sort of reintegrate into society. Yes, but you will never know unless you try. Okay. So there's a component here that has to be taken into account.
And we have to hope it just doesn't all exacerbate the problem tremendously in the meanwhile. But here's another issue that some are concerned about, because some suspect, Jonathan, I'll direct this to you, that Bukele is attempting to clean up El Salvador because he wants to attract that cryptocurrency investment that he's made such a show of and make El Salvador a more desirable destination. Could he be using the gang sweep as kind of a cover for also taking out some of the country's poorest people as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, if you look at the polling data, El Salvadorans feel unsafe. He has basically ran on a mandate of trying to clean up El Salvador. I think there's been massive human rights abuses. Prisons serve as schools of crime. My colleagues and I have interviewed thousands of members of MS-13, the 18th Street Gang, and been to prisons all throughout El Salvador. Many of them function as centers and epicenters of crime, as the previous analyst mentioned about prison rehabilitation. So I do think it's not only cryptocurrencies. I think he's trying to, yes, increase investment in El Salvador. Yes, make El Salvador more attractive as a destination for foreigners. But he's also responding to a mandate. People are sick of crime. They're sick of violence. But we've seen in El Salvador with Francisco Flores, with Tony Saca, with Mauricio Funes, mano dura, super mano dura, and kind of now the super iron fist strategies. And they haven't really worked. Prisons operate at 300% to 400% of over capacity, and it's not really solving a lot of these underlying issues. And there's been many other issues with cryptocurrency in addition to security issues.
Okay, so Jonathan, if you think this approach to gang violence or cracking down on gang violence isn't working, and we're also hearing more and more that this transition to Bitcoin that he had envisioned also isn't working, are you concerned about how far he might go to try and avoid political embarrassment via his rather unconventional policies? Because at the end of the day, he is a politician.
Yeah, I mean, he's had very rough relations with the United States, for example. He's very active via Twitter, criticizing, the Secretary of State, criticizing the President of the United States and other presidents as well. And I think that the real concern is that he's concentrated all power, and we've seen a lot of issues of death squads, issues of violations of human rights by the police and the military. And there's this question of where do we go from here? Where does this end, right? How many prisons are you going to build? And frankly, if I had to pin the number one problem in El Salvador, not just with Bukele, but over the last years, is corruption. The previous two presidents each stole $300+ million. So I think there's a lot of structural issues that need to be addressed.
You mentioned how he responded to the United States there. When he was warned by the U.S. to respect freedom of the press and due process, it was actually Anthony Blinken that warned him. Bukele immediately pointed out that the United States has Guantanamo Bay. That was his response, which for a second sounds like a good comeback, but then you actually think about the fact that he's equating his crackdown, with the infamous prison at Guantanamo Bay. He says, well, you have your terrorists and we have yours. Does he really feel, do you think, in his heart that because the U.S. has been able to violate human rights in the way he believes it has, he can get away with it too?
Well, I think he's a president of his own country. He's a sovereign country. He can do what he wants, right? But at the end of the day, it impacts him in terms of foreign aid, right? The U.S. does give a great deal of foreign aid through not only the Defense Department, USA, State Department, et cetera. But there's also this question of, in 2015, the Supreme Court of El Salvador labeled gang members as terrorists. So in reality, what you tend to see is people, young kids, typically young males are an MS-13, 90% are male, right, are really stigmatized and discriminated against and charged with terrorism for frankly living in poor, marginalized neighborhoods. So this is a very slippery slope. And I think that it's a dangerous strategy for him to mandate via Twitter. Right. And I think the international community, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, countries around the globe have been very, very critical, not just the United States, of frankly massive human rights abuses occurring in El Salvador. So many journalists have fled. He's used the military. It's alleged that he's used military to spy on journalists. El Faro, for example, is the outlet that released the documents about the secret negotiations for over a year. And many of the journalists have been threatened with arrest, threatened with charges of terrorism, and had to flee the country, some of them.
Right. Let me ask Colin, first of all, about what you've heard so far. And do you think, what Bukele might face in the future? Do you think he could face charges eventually if this keeps going in the direction it's going? Face charges at the ICC, perhaps, for the deaths of prisoners and human rights violations?
Well, he might eventually, but as long as he's in power, that he's not got anything to fear, and he shows every sign of, as it's been said, he's extremely popular. Surveys suggest that he has an approval rating, up to 90%, and particular policies like the crackdown on the gangs enjoy a popularity of more than 90%. So he doesn't feel that he has much to fear from the criticism he's received from the US, from the IMF, and so on. Who knows? One day, if these policies turn out to have been misguided, and there's every indication that they will, yes, there may be a comeback. But you see, the thing is with this kind of authoritarian rule, in which government consists really of a series of stunts, of rabbits pulled out of a hat by the president, you're never quite sure what he's going to try next. And there's no consistency. He's not interested in institutions, except for the Congress, which he controls absolutely. So he's really enjoying at the moment unchecked power, and
right.
the previous parties are so discredited that he doesn't have any opposition to worry about.
But let me ask Javier about that. That unchecked power he is enjoying right now could only be temporary. It's likely actually temporary. So what do you see in the future for President Bukele of El Salvador? And do you think he's taking into consideration at all what kind of international repercussions he might face should he lose power? Go ahead.
The Biden administration has criticized the fact that the president might have negotiated, the government might have negotiated with some matters, with some gangs, some kind of peace agreement. In fact, two high-ranking officials from the Bukele government were sanctioned by the US because it was rumored that they had been diverted funding, economic funding, to certain gangs to ask them to stop the violence. So that could be an international repercussion. The government in the US has been critical of any kind of negotiation, although President Bukele has denied that this has happened. But everybody in El Salvador knows that there was some negotiation. In fact, that negotiation led to the reduction of violence in 2019 and 2020 to 2021, a radical reduction of deaths per 100,000 inhabitants in El Salvador. At the same time, international organizations, the UN, has offered President Bukele resources to re-educate and reintegrate young members of gangs in order to prevent them from joining the gangs or get them out of the gangs. So there is a consensus within the international organizations, especially in the UN, that the children organizations, like the UN Commission on Human Rights, etc., who have got together in order to provide the government the resources they need to be able to help the young people who have been involved in these gangs. So internationally speaking, this is not seen well. It's always dangerous when a government takes the army, puts them in the streets of a city. It's happened before. It happened in Peru as well, when President Castillo tried to fight violence with the army. It didn't work out. But also, as one of the colleagues said, you can build many, many jails in El Salvador. That's not going to solve the problem, because jails never solve the situation of rehabilitating these people. So internationally speaking, it's very difficult to see how an investor, how a foreign investor would be reassured by President Bukele's policies, because if violence does not go down radically, they are not going to invest. And don't forget that these guns are very powerful, that were armed there like armies, like proper armies, like terrorist armies. And therefore, they have the capacity to mobilize people at a short term. In fact, the latest wave of violence happened in April. Nobody knows exactly how it happened, but it is believed that it came from the prisons. The order was given from the prisons, where the main leaders are, to the sort of the foot soldiers in the shanty towns. Now, this could happen any time, no matter how many violations of human rights are in El Salvador.
Right.
So I doubt that internationally is going to reassure investors, but at the same time, it could create a negative reaction from international organizations as well.
Okay. Jonathan, if you can help bring a little more clarity to the potential liabilities of what we're seeing enforced right now versus what Javier was talking about and what went on in those secret negotiations that you alluded to. You're also seeing now, and I need to mention that part of the policy is that police now have daily detention quotas in order to keep the numbers of arrests up. So there is a lot going on at present, but we're also hearing that there might be serious liability for what went on under the table in negotiations with these gangs before.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. came out in the Treasury Department and sanctioned members, as the colleague mentioned. You know, the allegations of negotiations have occurred. It wouldn't be the first time, right? You saw negotiations in El Salvador occur in 2012 and break down in 2014. The challenge with these negotiations, where they occurred over a year, and basically Bukele is cutting a deal with MS-13 to reduce levels of violence. In April, the argument of why you see levels of spikes in violence was that the negotiations broke down, and it's signaling to the people, right, that in Bukele is that they're not very happy, the gangs that is, with the negotiations. The problem with the negotiations are there's no transparency, there's no accountability, right? And frankly, you know, and we'll have to wait and see, right? And journalists play a very important role in this. Is there could be mismanagement of funds. I mean, the U.S. government has come out and the sanctioned through the Treasury Department members of the government. El Faro has a very large report that was published all around the world as well and released about these negotiations. There's a lot of documented evidence. And so when you talk about liabilities, the Bukele administration obviously backpedaling. He's, you know, claiming that El Faro is a fund of George Soros and it's all, you know, a myth. But at the end of the day, there could be repercussions for the crackdowns and human rights abuses. The quotas, arguments that Bukele has made to the police of don't worry if you get, you know, accused, if you write stuff, I'll pay for your legal fees. And this wouldn't be the first time. During the pandemic, we saw him violate, you know, quotas and, protocols for the quarantines, right? And so we've seen a lot of violations and concentration of power. And I think it's a very troubling trend. Overall, I would argue it's a very troubling trend of concentrating power and not focusing on strengthening democratic institutions, right? My question fundamentally is, where do we end from here? Where does this go, right?
Right. We'll have to actually hold a whole second program on that alone. Jonathan, I'm going to have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we're very much out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers, but I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.